On the 27th of October, 1962, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear catastrophe. The Cold War between the United States of America and the Soviet Union had reached a point of unprecedented tension, and the small island of Cuba, only 150 kilometers from the American coast, became the epicenter of global conflict. The island had undergone profound political change, as Fidel Castro, a young revolutionary, had taken power by ousting the American-backed puppet dictator and establishing a communist republic. Prior to Castro's rise, Cuba had been nominally independent, but heavily influenced by the United States. American corporations dominated much of the island's economy, controlling sugar, tobacco, and other key industries, while American-aligned leaders ensured that political decisions favored Washington. For decades, this arrangement allowed the United States to exercise significant control over Cuban affairs, exploiting the island's wealth while leaving many Cubans in poverty. Fidel Castro emerged as a leader, determined to challenge this dominance. With the support of a small but dedicated group of revolutionaries, he organized the Cuban Revolution, overthrowing the American-backed dictator. By 1959, Castro had assumed full control and began implementing sweeping reforms. Healthcare and education systems were radically improved, literacy campaigns were launched, and access to social services expanded. However, Castro also established a strict one-party system. Independent media was shut down, political opposition was imprisoned, and dissent was harshly suppressed. In the complex balance of reform and repression, Cuba now stood as a communist stronghold only 150 kilometers from the United States. Shortly after assuming power, Castro faced an immediate challenge from the United States. The American government, intent on reversing the revolution and restoring a pro-American regime, supported an invasion of the island. This operation, known as the Bay of Pigs, involved approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles trained and equipped by the CIA. They attempted to land on Cuba's southern coast and ignite a popular uprising to overthrow Castro's regime. However, Castro, anticipating such an attack, mobilized between 20 and 25,000 troops. The invading force was quickly defeated, suffering total collapse and humiliation. This victory not only secured Castro's rule but also cemented Cuba's alliance with the Soviet Union, shifting the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. With Cuba as an ally, the Soviet Union saw an opportunity to challenge American dominance and gain a strategic foothold in the Caribbean. Moscow began secretly shipping nuclear weapons, missile components, and advanced military equipment to Cuba under the codename Operation Anadir. Soviet troops were disguised in civilian clothes, and missile components were transported as if they were agricultural equipment. These weapons included medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles capable of striking almost every major city in the United States within minutes, including New York, Washington, D.C., Houston, and Miami. The United States, initially unaware of the missile buildup, gradually began to suspect unusual military activity on the island. American intelligence and spy planes monitored Cuban airfields, naval bases, and transportation hubs. On the 14th of October, 1962, U-2 reconnaissance planes captured photographic evidence of missile installations under construction. President John M. Kennedy, upon reviewing the evidence, convened a group of his closest advisors and military leaders, forming the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as ExComm. The committee debated the United States' response, weighing the risks and consequences of each option. Three primary options emerged. The first was an airstrike targeting all known missile sites. While it promised rapid neutralization, it carried the risk of missing hidden sites, which could provoke retaliation from the Soviet Union and potentially trigger a full-scale nuclear war. The second option was a full-scale invasion of Cuba, similar to the Bay of Pigs operation but on a much larger scale. This option was also highly risky, requiring massive American military deployment and possibly igniting a direct confrontation with Soviet forces. The third option, ultimately chosen by Kennedy, was a naval blockade, euphemistically called a quarantine, intended to prevent further Soviet shipments of military equipment and missiles from reaching Cuba. This approach was intended to buy time for diplomatic negotiations while avoiding immediate escalation into direct conflict. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, publicly condemned the blockade, criticizing the United States for hypocrisy. He pointed out that the US had stationed nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy, directly threatening the Soviet Union, yet denied the Soviets the right to do the same in Cuba, a sovereign nation. On the 24th of October, the US Navy began the quarantine, intercepting Soviet vessels approaching Cuban waters. Soviet ships and submarines halted at the edge of the blockade, creating a tense standoff that could have erupted into war at any moment. Meanwhile, construction of missile sites in Cuba continued, adding further urgency to the situation. The crisis reached a critical point on the 27th of October. Khrushchev sent a letter to Kennedy proposing a solution. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba if the United States agreed to withdraw its missiles from Turkey. This proposal required careful deliberation, as a hasty acceptance could be perceived as a sign of weakness by the international community, while outright rejection could lead to a catastrophic escalation. On the same day, Soviet anti-aircraft forces shot down an American U-2 reconnaissance plane over Cuba, increasing tensions and creating a real threat of immediate military retaliation. In a decisive move, President Kennedy sent his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, to meet privately with the Soviet ambassador in Washington. The purpose was to negotiate the secret terms of the agreement, ensuring that a public perception of US strength was maintained while avoiding a nuclear confrontation. The negotiations were tense, delicate, and required absolute secrecy, as any leak could have triggered panic or military escalation. Simultaneously, Soviet submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes were operating dangerously close to the US blockade. The captain of submarine B-59, believing that war might have already begun, was prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo against the American fleet. The decision, however, required the consent of all senior officers aboard. Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet naval officer aboard the submarine, refused to authorize the launch. His decision, grounded in calm judgment under immense pressure, prevented a nuclear exchange that could have destroyed cities across the United States, Cuba, and potentially escalated into global nuclear war. Arkhipov's restraint became a pivotal moment in the crisis, demonstrating the profound impact of individual action in moments of historical consequence. By the 28th of October, the Soviets began dismantling their missiles and nuclear weapons in Cuba, shipping them back to the Soviet Union under international supervision. The United States, in turn, secretly removed its missiles from Turkey several months later. Fidel Castro remained loyal to the Soviet Union until its collapse in 1991, even as relations with non-communist nations gradually improved. Castro himself stayed in power for nearly 5 decades, surviving over 600 assassination attempts and ultimately passing away in 2016 at the age of 90. The Cuban Missile Crisis had profound and lasting consequences for international relations. It led to the establishment of a direct communication line between Washington and Moscow, later known as the Hotline, enabling faster communication during emergencies and reducing the risk of accidental nuclear war.